Welcome to Living Chronic, the podcast that explores the realities of living with chronic illness and disability while redefining how we thrive in our personal and professional lives. I'm your host, Brandy Schantz, a disabled veteran and chronic illness warrior, here to discuss the challenges, triumphs, and untapped potential of life with a chronic condition. Before we dive in, please take a minute to hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening. Now, let's change the way we think about disability together. This is Brandy Schantz, and you're listening to Living Chronic. Today I'm here with Mindy Uhrlaub. She is an author, recently published the book Last Nerve, and she's here to talk about her new book, advocacy work, and her life living as a caregiver and another chronic warrior. So, welcome, Mindy.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for being here. We've had some great, conversations about everything you've been through. And of course, being both a caregiver and somebody living with a chronic illness does give you a very interesting perspective. I try to talk to the caregivers just as often as I do people with chronic illness because I know how difficult it is to be a caregiver for somebody going through this. But why don't you just start by telling us a little bit about your story?
Um, Thanks for asking. Actually, my story is multifaceted. In 2018, my mother was about halfway through her journey with ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is a fatal uh, motor neuron disease. And during that time, my husband started becoming ill with the first signs of cancer, and he had to be treated with chemotherapy for a large diffuse B cell lymphoma. It was stage 4 because it was in his blood and in his marrow. And if that weren't difficult enough, I had a child who was in junior high who was misbehaving pretty badly and experimenting with drugs and breaking the law and lying about it. And we made the heartbreaking decision to send him away to a therapeutic boarding school. So he was in residential treatment when all that was happening. And I also had a 12-year-old who I was caring for. And then I found out that I was a carrier of the C9orf72 gene for ALS and frontotemporal degeneration, FTD. So it was one giant matzo ball hanging out there.
Mhm.
Lots of things
Yes.
going on at once.
I mean, and it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. I can't imagine going through taking in this new information that you have this gene that's going to cause exactly what you know is going to happen, taking care of your mom, your husband has been diagnosed. But you and I wrote this down and I said this to a few people since I last spoke with you. You said I didn't get mad, I got active. And I really like that because that is a very healing and therapeutic way to get through a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, as you know, you can take your head and bury it in the sand in the face of chronic illness, or you can actually do something about it. And, with ALS, that's really a disease that takes everything from you. And for me, participating in research and activism, you know, doing policy work and talking to lots of people about ALS awareness really gave me agency over that gene that I carry. But
Mhm.
I was active in caring for my son also and caring for my husband. So I wasn't going to let things just slip. And it's hard to feel like you're in control when your husband is dying of cancer or your child is breaking the
Yeah.
law. But if you can stay dialed in and really focus on the things you can be active in, it can make a huge difference in your own mental health.
And, that's what we talk about on this podcast all the time. We've talked about it. Your mental health, that's the component that nobody really puts as much emphasis on as they should. I am always asked, how am I feeling? I'm sure you're always asked about your husband, his health, maybe your mother. What's the treatment plan look like? What are you doing to uh, get to the next treatment? Whatever that might be, whether it be just transportation or phone calls to the insurance company. We all know how much work is entailed in being a sick person, being a caregiver, having to deal with insurance and figuring out your own healthcare plan, really, because there's nobody there to do it for you. And in addition to all of that, there's this mental health component. And very few people, friends, doctors, nurses, family, you name it, there's very few people that just say, you know what, how are you doing mentally and emotionally?
Yeah.
Because that's the one that really takes you down.
Well, yeah, and you have to advocate for yourself. I mean, nobody ever said to me, "You need to get a psychotherapist."
Right.
But I definitely had moments there where, I mean, family members would do interventions with me and be like, "Wow, you are such a nervous wreck. Can you do something about that that does not have to do with just seeing a therapist?" Um, and with because my kids begged me to, I went on an antidepressant, anti-anxiety medicine because I
Hmm.
wasn't going to make it otherwise. And so
Right.
that's actually part of my mental health journey also, was being in touch with the fact that I had a really serious anxiety problem and that the situations around me were not going to make it any easier.
No, and there's so much about being a sick person, about being somebody who knows they will become sick because you've tested for a gene, and for someone who's a caregiver. There's so much involved in that that it can be overwhelming, and it creates its own anxiety, right? Because you're dealing with something new every day. You never know what your day is going to bring you. You don't, you become so used to something happening, you almost start to expect it. My day will go bad because, or, this is about to happen because it's happened 14 times. So you start to feel this anxiety around it. And, there's nothing wrong with, of course, like you said, with reaching out and saying, okay, it's time to explore options in a medication because it's not easy to get through.
Yeah, and it's also, nobody had to tell me that I had to reach out to other community members for help. I mean, that was really
Mhm.
obvious. It was not something that I could have done by myself. I was not my mom's caregiver. Her full time caregiver was her then partner, my stepdad.
Right.
And I was thrust into the role of caregiver when I was kind of spelling him and giving him a break. But he
Mhm.
never had any help. I mean, he never really asked for help. He never, even when hospice was in the room, he didn't really let them do much because that was his way of coping, was just to be the hands-on person all the time. And for me, um, I was just caregiving everyone I could caregive when they would let me, you know?
Yes. Yes. But I know you did find other ways to kind of just get out of the situation a little bit. And of course, becoming involved is so important. I can never emphasize that enough to my listeners, anybody who's going through this, who has recently been diagnosed or has a family member or friend recently diagnosed, and you just don't know what to do. Get involved. It gives you that sense of control in some ways, but it also teaches you as you go, because you feel crazy at every turn. Is this, am I crazy? Is this supposed to be happening? Am I nuts? Does this happen to everybody? Oh, is it just me? And am I the only one feeling this anxiety? And when you become involved, you realize that there's nothing crazy, there's nothing abnormal about you. But of course, you have to really kind of clear your mind too. And we talked about exercise, walking the dog. Dogs are such an amazing way to just, feel better somehow in a world where it doesn't seem like there's any reason to feel better, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, there are so many different ways that you can let off steam when you're dealing with trauma. And for me, it was, everything from taking myself to, to a movie, to, walking the dog, to, I have a pretty strict exercise plan, and, I was working out 4 times a week, and that helps to just sweat it out. But,
Mhm.
like bringing in community members and asking them to help out also is helpful. And you find support in the strangest places. I mean, I was a caregiver mentee for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society while my husband was going through chemotherapy. And so I would talk to other
Mhm.
spouses of cancer survivors or cancer patients. And the more I talked about my trauma, the better they felt and the better I felt. And so it's sort of like a two-way street of healing. When you talk to somebody about their own trauma, it kind of makes you feel a little bit better about yours.
Yes. Yes, it does. Yeah, it absolutely does. And that means something, you know? That's part of what this podcast is all about.
Right.
It's cathartic. You learn from somebody else, you understand their pain and suffering, you understand your own better. You talk about it, you get it out of your system, and that's how we take those little steps to be able to get to a better place. And better mental health does lead to better physical health.
Yeah, I agree.
It absolutely does. Yeah. So, what inspired you to write your book, Last Nerve?
I was already an author. I had been in a couple of anthologies for some essays I had written, and I had written a screenplay when I was younger. I have also written music for a band. And so I was already a writer. And the last book that I wrote was about some of the activism that I did when I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that book, Unnatural Resources, was a novel that came out about 5 years ago. And I really learned how to be a humanitarian and an activist through the women in Congo. That
Mhm.
said, I mean, I had those muscles already, and I had the writing muscles, so it just was a very natural thing for me to carry around a journal with me and, kind of write about what I could possibly be doing to make things easier for people with ALS and their caregivers and people at genetic risk. And so I think it started with me journaling back in like 2017 or something. I started noticing my mom's foot drop in 2016, and my husband was already sick in 2017, and my kid was already going off the rails. So I found that, you know, journaling was really therapeutic. And then I started reading it, and I was like, wait a minute, this makes for some really interesting storytelling. And so in 2018, I started to apply to writers' residencies and started taking that journal and turning it into a book.
So tell me more about the book. For me, if obviously, being the sick person with the podcast, I love reading this. It's therapeutic for all of us. It's therapeutic for all of us. But, for everybody out there who wants to know why read about ALS, tell tell me in your own words what you feel is the power of this book.
Well, I mean, it's kind of what we were talking about, that, like, when you find out that you have crappy medical news, you can kind of cry about it or you can do something about it. And I
Mhm.
think that it's probably pretty unusual for people to be like, all right, I have a genetic predisposition for a, fatal neurodegenerative disease. I might not get it. Who knows? There's not enough research out there to know if I'll get it or not. But, I have kids and they might get it because I'm a carrier.
Mhm.
So, it's kind of like, I think the idea is that people want to hear hopeful stories. And,
Mhm.
people who are activists tend to be very hopeful people, because if there's no hope, there's no activism, and there's no activism without, it doesn't, they don't, you can't have one without the
Yes.
other. So
Yeah.
I think that, when faced with what's what I would consider to be insurmountable odds, the underdog is a really interesting person to read about. And the fact that
Mhm.
I took this diagnosis and I turned it into something beautiful. I mean, I often say that being diagnosed with carrying a fatal neurodegenerative disease was the best thing to ever happen to me. I mean, I feel like it was maybe one of the best things to happen to the genetic ALS community too, because a lot of people walking around with these genes just don't want to talk about it. And,
Right.
it's like raising awareness and, being there for my kid and being there for my mom and being there for my husband and my family and my community has really given me such a better life than I had before.
Mhm.
And so,
It connects you in so many ways.
yeah,
Yeah. What's we're both so alike in so many ways. I loved hearing about your work in the Congo. I worked in Afghanistan with women, and it was without a doubt the most fulfilling job of my life. And being able to help people in your own way, however, whatever that might look like, who are so disadvantaged, it gives you so much perspective for what you're going through.
it does. Yeah.
So having some, yeah. So having something like this come into your life, I think when you have that background, it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, this is where I'm at and this is terrible, but let's see what I can do better because I have the opportunity. Because we know that not everybody has the opportunities we do.
Well, yeah. And I mean, really, the only difference between me and women in Congo is like where we were born and, the
Hmm.
color of our skin. But we're this,
Time and
yeah.
geography.
And so I think that, part of that realization helps you realize, this is what I have in common with my husband who has cancer. This is what I have in common with my own child. This is what I have in common with
Hmm.
people around the world who are going through trauma. They talk about trauma as being, um, you know, deeply affecting for people. And sometimes trauma is, is, is what causes you to become a more resilient person. And I
Hmm.
think that, yeah, I saw it in women in Congo. I mean, they've been through unspeakable violence and terrible discrimination. And, I think that it really, I took a lot of lessons from that experience.
It's so insightful, I think, and I wish everybody could have that kind of experience because it's a terrible thing to happen. But I think you and I had very similar reactions in many ways to take what we do have and reach out and try to help others, even if we have lost a lot in our lives, and we both have. You've gone through so much unspeakable just tragedy and difficulty and strife and all of these things that you've had to deal with in life, but you have this perspective, okay, take a step back, let me deal with this. And I think a lot of that does come from that having that something within to reach out and help and think about the things that you do have rather than only the things that you don't have. I think the difficulty often, and it's not just people like us, I mean, well, people like us in other ways, women, we do tend to give too much and we don't want to complain. So I think often the difficult part for us is figuring out how to grieve what we have lost and not feel some sort of blame for that or feel that you're you know wrong in some way for grieving and feeling bad for what you have lost. How have you balanced that, you know strive to give back and do and help, and that part of you that says, I need to grieve, I need to allow myself to just cry it out or feel sorry for myself, I'm justified, it's okay.
Yeah, it's weird. There were times during this period when I wanted to just be in bed and like put my head under the covers and hide. And there
Mhm.
were days where it was really hard for me to get out of bed. But when you have a 12-year-old at home, I mean, 12 is not old enough to, uh, I mean, he could get himself to school and make a meal for himself, but you can't just hide, when you have a little kid at home. And so,
Mhm.
um, I think that the heart is a tremendous organ that has the capacity to do so many different things. And you can compartmentalize in your head the grief that you feel for losing your mother to ALS, the grief that you feel when you see your husband struggling to keep his food down or unable to have the energy to do something because of chemo, and the grief that you feel over the loss of a relationship between you and a child who has gone so far off the rails that you feel like you don't have them back. You can take all those things and put them in a little box, and at the same time have the feelings of love for those same people and admiration for the beautiful day that's outside, and open up your heart to people who need you, and you know uh, continue to learn and be able to write a book at the same time. Like, it's just,
Mhm.
we all have this capacity, and women, I think, are interesting because we're very good multitaskers. It
Yes.
doesn't mean that we do everything completely right, and I'm sure I screwed up a lot along the way. But um, there was a moment where, like, my husband had a lumbar puncture that went bad, and he started like
Mm.
losing spinal fluid into his body
Oh,
cavity, and
no.
he had a leak, and I had to take him to the emergency room. And I had a 12-year-old at home who I dropped at a friend's house, and I called the dog walker, and I asked someone else to walk the dog, and I, like, drove my husband to the hospital. And I remember thinking, like, wow, this is insane. I'm sitting here in a hospital room, and I'm not the one who's being cared for, like I
Mhm.
completely feel in control of the situation because I was able to orchestrate, like, you know, how does Alex get to camp today, and how do we get dinner on the table and all this other stuff. And I just think it's because women's brains work a little differently than men's, but I think that our hearts
Mhm.
work differently too. I think we just are
Mhm.
expected to be able to take on a lot at once. And so we do.
Yeah. Yeah, we do. And it's an amazing quality. I think that's it's one of the things we should embrace, and never forget that we do have these big hearts and we do have the capacity to take on a lot and help a lot and love a lot and grieve a lot and all of those things. All of those things. And they're all great qualities.
Yeah. And even when you feel that you're like at your weakest, where you're just like, oh God, the sky is falling. That
Mhm.
actually, you can find a lot of grace in that.
Yes, you can. It's very difficult, though. It's very difficult. How do you find the insight and the strength to find the grace in that?
Well, I mean, and going back a few years, but um, like when I was at my very, very lowest, um, I spoke to somebody, relative. I actually have a relative who's a rabbi, and I was like, I feel like, like, I'm not a religious person, but I know who Job was, and I'm like, I don't think anyone can suffer this much. Like, I don't think I can suffer like this. And he said, I know I'm talking to a heathen, but I'm just going to tell you to, like, go and look for signs that you're not alone. Look for signs in the littlest things. And I was like, well, I mean, we have a lot of hummingbirds in our yard because we're in California. But I hung up the phone, and it was kind of crazy. I walked out the front door, and I was sitting on the veranda, and I was like, okay, the little things, the little things. And this buck, like a huge deer with a huge, like, rack of antlers, walks right up to the house on the driveway. And, like,
Oh,
we
wow.
have deer, but they're not. I'm in a neighborhood. Like, we don't see. They don't
Right.
walk down our street. And I remember thinking, this is not a little thing. Like, life goes on. The nature goes on, the world goes on,
Mhm.
whether I suffer or not. I'm going to take this moment and admire the majesty of this ginormous animal in my driveway. And I don't know. I mean, I felt like that was kind of a turning point for me. I really did. I feel like,
Yeah.
okay, like it's a big deal that I'm losing my mom. It's a big deal that my husband has cancer. It's a
Mhm.
big deal that my child is suffering. Both of my children were suffering, you know, and it's a
Mhm.
big deal that I have this
Yeah.
diagnosis. But like, Mother Nature has other things in store for us, and it's important to remember that, like, to that buck, like him sharpening his antlers on my tree was the most important thing. That was a big deal for him. So, like,
Yeah.
okay.
I love that that's your example because for me, and I know everybody's different, and I always tell everybody find your meaning, find your special place, find what's important to you. We're all different. There's no one way. But for me, it is nature. Being outside and being with nature is so important to my mental health and how I feel. There's nothing worse than this horrific heat wave where I cannot go outside because it feels like 110 degrees in Washington, D.C. right now.
Right.
I like to be outside and I go as many places as I can and I go for that hike or just sit on the bench if that's all I can do. If that's all I'm feeling for the day, I'll just get my little cane out and just clickety click 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 to my little seat and sit there because there's just so much beauty and insight in nature where you see these beautiful, beautiful creatures that bring so much peace, and you do see what's important to them. And it might just be, coming over to see if you've got some food for them, or maybe sharpening their antlers on a tree, or, grabbing sometimes I spend a lot of time outdoors, so I also get to see the circle of life, which doesn't always make me happy. But you do start to see this, what's important, what happens, what goes on, when the bird grabs his, food and it's another cute little bird, darn it,
Right.
or his fish out of the water.
Right.
Um, it is something beautiful and grounding, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all good, and I think that music can make you feel the same way. I think that
Hmm.
music is very healing, and having played in a band for a long time, I know it for sure.
Oh,
But
wow.
like I have a son who is a musician, and that's his healing place. Is like he likes to be outside too, but really, there's nothing like writing a piece of music. And
Yes.
yeah, the creative process plugging into that other thing is pretty awesome too.
Yeah, no, I love that one also. I am not talented like that, but I imagine it's got to be an amazing outlet for all of this. So, if you could just give everybody one piece of advice as they're going through just what feels like you said, the sky is falling, there's no way out, it's too much. What would be your number one top advice to people going through that?
Well, we were just talking about kind of reaching out of ourselves, right? And thinking about other things so that we're not like ruminating on the horrible. But the idea of just loving the world harder,
Yeah.
love the world harder. We don't have enough of that. And I think that helps. Um, you know, I think there's a close second, which is, you know, live your life larger, you
Hmm.
know?
Oh, I love that. Yeah, live that life larger. Yeah, live your life larger. I like it. And love harder. Those are two really great pieces of advice. I think that's it's all, everybody's and we're all people, that's we can't stop being people. So we're all vulnerable to going through these kinds of things no matter where you think, you might be, how healthy you might be, or, whatever. None of us are immune.
Right.
So I think those are two really great pieces of advice for anybody going through this. Love harder. And that's great. So where can we buy your book, Last Nerve?
You can buy my book, Last Nerve, just about anywhere. You can order it on Amazon. You can go to your local bookstore and order it through your local bookstore. or you can attend a in-person event. I have lots of those, and you can check out my current schedule of events at mindywurlaub.com.
I'll say, and I will have that in the show notes as well. So if you want to check out her website, order that book, the show notes will have her website. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Mindy. This has been wonderful.
Thank you for having me, and please be well.
Thank you. That's a wrap for this episode of Living Chronic. I hope today's conversation gave you insight, inspiration, or at least a little reassurance that you're not alone on this journey. Living with a chronic illness or disability comes with its challenges, but it also comes with strength, resilience, and a community that understands. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. You could follow me on Instagram at Chronically Brandy Schantz, other socials at Brandy Schantz, or my website at brandyschantz.com for more discussions, advocacy updates, and everyday strategies for thriving with a chronic illness. And if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep pushing forward, keep advocating for yourself, and remember, you are more than your diagnosis. You are powerful, you are unstoppable. Thanks for listening to Living Chronic. See you next time.